Under the soft golden light filtering through the stained glass windows of St. Cecilia's convent, the air carried a strange stillness in recent weeks. Nestled on a quiet hillside and surrounded by dense pine woods, the convent had long been considered a place of peace and prayer, where generations of nuns had lived in austere devotion. The previous Mother Superior had passed quietly in her sleep after 40 years of service, and her death was mourned with the solemn dignity expected of the sisters. However, as tradition dictated, a new leader was chosen not long after. Sister Miriam. Sister Miriam arrived from another diocese, one far away and largely unknown to the others. She was in her early 60s, tall and thin, with gray streaks carefully braided beneath her veil. Her voice was soft, her presence calm, and her gaze unreadable. She spoke rarely and moved slowly with deliberate care, as if weighing every word and every step. On the surface, her appointment seemed unremarkable, even reassuring to the younger nuns who longed for steady guidance. She carried herself with the gravitas of experience and the serenity of a woman long immersed in sacred duty. But beneath, the quiet admiration lay unease, subtle at first, almost unspoken. It began with the silence. Unlike her predecessor, who often prayed with the sisters or walked with them in the garden reciting verses, Sister Miriam kept to herself. She declined communal meals, often taking her tray to her quarters. She remained absent from evening prayers without explanation, and her door remained locked long after lights out. The older sisters chalked it up to age or grief. The younger ones whispered theories, none of which were serious enough to reach the chapel. What truly marked a change in atmosphere was her presence in the chapel. During daylight, she was rarely seen inside. But at night, a faint light often glowed behind the altar, barely perceptible through the frosted glass pane of the side corridor. Sister Beatrice, one of the novices, once claimed she'd heard murmuring past midnight like a chant that didn't belong to any known prayer. But when she tiptoed to check, she saw nothing, only the smell of extinguished candles hanging in the air. Sister Miriam dismissed the concerns without offense, but with an unsettling calmness. "Some souls pray longer than others," she said, once, her tone flat and unsmiling. After that, few questioned her habits. The days went on, marked by routine. Morning bells, chores, vespers, silence. But the energy within the walls had shifted. The birdsong seemed fainter. The garden, though blooming, felt somehow less alive. Even the statue of St. Cecilia at the chapel's entrance began to collect a strange, dusty pallor despite weekly cleaning. The convent itself had a long history, and in its older wings there were corners barely used, alcoves from centuries ago, passageways once closed for repairs and forgotten. When Sister Miriam requested access to the basement archives, the request was granted without hesitation. The archives were rarely visited, filled with fading manuscripts, crumbling hymnals, and old robes no longer worn. She began spending more and more time there, locking the door behind her. Sometimes, faint footsteps echoed from underneath the chapel floor at strange hours. Within the convent, things that had always worked began to fail. The lights in the east hallway flickered and went dark, though no electrician could find a fault. Candles burned unevenly. A small crucifix fell from the infirmary wall without reason. Yet none of this could be directly linked to Sister Miriam. She never raised her voice. She never complained. She never gave commands beyond the necessary, and yet her presence cast a long shadow. Sister Helen, one of the few with access to the chapel records, began to notice a pattern in the prayer log. Each night, past midnight, someone had signed in under the initials MS, Miriam's religious signature. But the time was always odd: 12:13 a.m., 12:40 a.m., 1:03 a.m. When asked, Sister Miriam merely smiled. "Some prayers are meant for the night," she said. Weeks passed. Then came the suggestion to install a new security system. Not for suspicion, at least not openly, but for safety. An incident in a nearby parish involving theft had prompted the church to recommend surveillance for religious buildings. The convent complied. 4 cameras were installed discreetly, 2 in the garden, 1 in the kitchen, and 1 in the chapel, just above the altar, facing the pews. Sister Miriam blessed the cameras with holy water and said nothing more. The following nights were unremarkable, at least on the surface. The nuns carried on. Sister Miriam continued her midnight visits to the chapel. But now, there was a new presence in the darkness. The lens of a silent camera, waiting, watching, documenting. It was not until Sister Beatrice, reviewing the footage at the request of the groundskeeper, noticed something unusual in one of the saved clips, that everything began to unravel. And in that brief, grainy footage, the calm exterior of Sister Miriam would begin to fracture, not with loud revelation but with quiet dread, as if the camera had seen something not meant for earthly eyes. Late one night, long after the lights in the convent had gone out and the last evening prayer had been whispered into the stone walls of St. Agnes Monastery, Sister Miriam moved quietly through the silent halls. Her slippers barely made a sound as she passed, under arched ceilings and dim religious paintings that seemed to watch her from their frames. She walked with the slow certainty of someone who had rehearsed this journey many times before. The air was cool, filled with the faint scent of incense and candle wax, but also something heavier, more ancient. At the far end of the chapel, behind the altar where the Virgin statue stood draped in soft gold fabric, there was a locked door that most believed led only to old storage. Few questioned it. Even fewer had ever seen it open. It was here that the camera had been installed. A week earlier, a young groundskeeper named Elias had grown uneasy about strange occurrences at night. Doors left ajar, lights flickering on after dark, soft footsteps in corridors no one should have been walking through. When he had brought it up to the local parish priest, he was brushed off kindly but firmly. So Elias, who had always been quiet and technically minded, bought a small surveillance camera with his own savings and installed it behind the altar under the pretense of doing maintenance. The tiny device was camouflaged against the stone, its lens peeking out from behind a carved wooden relief of St. Peter. No one noticed, not even the nuns who dusted and polished the sanctuary each morning. The footage it recorded was clear, enough though the lighting was limited. The camera captured the altar room in full, the floor of stone tiles, the wooden pulpit to the left, the thick red curtain covering the rear alcove, and the flickering sanctuary lamp that glowed even after midnight. The timestamp flickered in the lower corner, silent and undeniable. The first few nights passed with nothing but stillness. Occasionally a flicker of candlelight, the distant creak of the convent's aging beams. Then, on the fourth night, the footage changed. At exactly 12:03 a.m., the rear curtain twitched. From behind it, Sister Miriam stepped out, her face calm, almost serene. She was barefoot, wearing a long, unbelted robe. The lighting caught her in soft shadows, but it was unmistakably her. She moved directly to the altar, not pausing to glance at the camera, though it was well hidden. Her hands moved with familiarity, opening a drawer beneath the altar that few had ever noticed. From it, she retrieved an old leather-bound book, worn at the edges and sealed with a clasp. She placed it gently on the altar, then turned toward the red votive lamp and extinguished it with a small puff of breath. The sudden darkness made the screen momentarily dim, but the camera's low-light sensor adjusted quickly. What followed was stranger still. Sister Miriam opened the book, flipping to a marked page. Her lips moved as she read silently. Then she knelt, not in prayer, but in concentration. Her eyes remained fixed on the pages, her mouth forming syllables that did not belong to the familiar Latin chants heard during Mass. They were softer, rounder, slower. Her posture was firm, yet her hands trembled as they traced the script. Elias, watching the footage the next morning, could hardly believe what he saw. He rewound it, then again. The way she moved, the cadence of her gestures. It wasn't prayer. At least not the kind he recognized. There was a rhythm to it, something rehearsed and possibly much older than Catholic liturgy. At 12:37 a.m. she stood, closed the book, returned it to the drawer, and relit the votive lamp. Then she slipped behind the curtain again and vanished. The camera recorded only silence after that. The following nights revealed a pattern. Each night, the same time. Each night, the same ritual. Only small things changed. Sometimes the book was replaced with a different one, or she lit an extra candle, or added a strange, unfamiliar object to the altar. A dried flower, a strip of cloth, a smooth stone. And each time she uttered those same silent incantations that did not belong to any known prayer book. By the end of the week, Elias had collected over 6 hours of footage. He didn't know what he was looking at, but he knew it wasn't just a nun praying after dark. There was an intent behind it, something unspoken but heavy, something sacred or profane. He wasn't sure. But what disturbed him most wasn't what Sister Miriam did each night. It was what happened on the 7th night, because on that night, she wasn't alone. At 12:04 a.m., she stepped out as usual. She lit a single tall candle in front of the altar and began her ritual. But partway through, the curtain behind her rustled again. A second figure appeared. Smaller, thinner, moving with hesitation. Another nun, younger. Elias couldn't see her face clearly, but she wore the same habit and robe. She paused behind Sister Miriam, then slowly knelt beside her. Sister Miriam did not react. Instead, she continued her chant, allowing the girl to mirror her movements. The two of them together now, facing the same book, the same candlelight, the same silence. The ritual continued for nearly an hour. Then, without speaking or gesturing, they stood together. The younger nun disappeared back behind the curtain. Sister Miriam relit the lamp and vanished as before. That night, Elias saved the video twice. Once on the hard drive, once on a USB he kept hidden under his mattress. Something about it felt bigger than anything he could understand. He thought about telling someone, the priest again. Or maybe, the police. But something inside him said to wait. He didn't know it yet, but the camera behind the altar had captured something forbidden, something buried not only beneath the marble and stone of the old monastery, but within the church itself. A secret stitched into centuries of ritual, now stirred awake by the midnight hands of a woman everyone thought they knew. Deep beneath the aged foundations of St. Martha's convent, hidden behind layers of ancient brick and forgotten architecture, lay a chamber long abandoned by history. For decades, perhaps even centuries, it had remained sealed, its entrance obscured by time, dust, and a thick sense of foreboding that seemed to seep through the stone itself. The nuns knew nothing of its presence, and those who had once walked its halls were long dead, their knowledge buried with them. Only one person held the key now. The head nun, Mother Isadora. The passage that led to the chamber was not something one could find easily. It was concealed behind the altar itself, hidden within a narrow crevice in the rear wall of the sanctuary, its edge masked by old wood paneling and religious iconography. Mother Isadora knew precisely where to press, a specific knot in the carved figure of St. Agnes. With a faint click and a soft groan of aged wood, the panel gave way to a descending staircase shrouded in darkness and stale, damp air. She always descended slowly, her footsteps careful but deliberate, her long robes brushing the dust-covered walls. The hallway leading to the underground room was narrow, barely wide enough for a person to pass through comfortably. The walls were rough, with patches of moss spreading across the stone like veins under skin. The air grew colder with every step downward, and the only illumination came from the flickering light of a candle she carried in a metal holder, its flame casting elongated shadows that danced over the uneven surfaces. The smell was of earth, decay, and something else, something metallic and sharp that lingered in the back of the throat. At the base of the stairs, a large iron door stood like a sentinel, its surface etched with worn symbols no longer legible. The handle was rusted but still functional, and with a firm grip Isadora would turn it, listening to the slow scrape of metal against metal. The chamber beyond was vast, far larger than one would expect beneath such a modest building. It was circular in shape, its domed ceiling held up by 6 stone columns arranged evenly around the room. The architecture suggested something older than the convent itself, perhaps even predating the church that once stood on these grounds. It was not a chapel nor a crypt, but something altogether different. The center of the chamber held a raised platform, circular, waist-high, and covered in faded red cloth that looked as though it hadn't been touched in decades. Around it, 6 wooden chairs stood like silent witnesses, each facing inward. Faint markings circled the base of the platform, patterns too worn to decipher, but unmistakably deliberate. On one side of the room stood a wooden table, its surface scratched and scorched, holding an assortment of unmarked jars, aged scrolls, and tools whose original purposes were lost to time. Above the table hung a mirror framed in blackened silver, its glass clouded yet still reflecting something deeper than its surface suggested. Every midnight, Mother Isadora would enter this room alone, moving with reverence and purpose. Her face changed here, calm but devoid of the serene grace she showed in daylight. Here, her eyes narrowed with calculation, her posture stiffened with ritual. She would light the candles set along the outer wall one by one, each flame adding to the eerie glow that filled the room with a soft, golden pulse. Once the chamber was fully lit, she would change from her habit into a different garment, thicker, ceremonial, bearing embroidered sigils that no one in the convent would recognize. She performed the change behind the columns, as if she feared even the inanimate eyes of the statues lining the room might witness her transformation. After dressing, she would approach the platform and remove a small box from the folds of her ceremonial robes. Inside were slips of paper, worn, creased, ink-smudged, and a small vial filled with a dark liquid that shimmered unnaturally in the candlelight. She would drink the contents of the vial slowly, her face contorting briefly as if the taste repulsed her, and then she would read the papers aloud. The words were whispered, unintelligible even if heard clearly, but they seemed to resonate in the room as if echoing from the walls themselves. The mirror behind her remained still until it didn't. One night the surface of the mirror began to ripple, not like water but like silk, blowing in wind. The reflection twisted, showing not Isadora but an older woman, her face partly shadowed, her mouth moving in perfect synchrony with the head nun's whispers. Isadora did not flinch. This was not unexpected. She merely lowered her head in submission. The mirror pulsed once with light, then dimmed. The ritual had been accepted. No one knew how long this had been happening. There were no records of this chamber in the convent's archives. The older nuns never spoke of it, and the newer ones hadn't the faintest clue of what existed beneath their feet. The altar above it had been renovated decades ago, but the passage was never discovered. Some things were never meant to be found. But lately, things had begun to change. A strange buzzing had been reported by Sister Miriam in the sanctuary during late hours. Another nun had found her candle extinguished without explanation. The lights above the altar had flickered more frequently, though no electrical issues were found. And one night, unknown to Isadora, a camera had been placed behind the altar, installed for security reasons after the local bishop requested better documentation of church grounds due to recent break-ins in nearby religious buildings. It was this camera, positioned just high enough to catch the faintest sliver of the panel's edge, that would capture the moment the entrance to the passage creaked open. It would not catch the words she spoke or the contents of the chamber below, but it would show her vanishing into a wall that no one believed could open. It would show her reappear 2 hours later, pale and breathless, her eyes not focused on anything as she climbed the stairs slowly, clutching the folds of her robe with shaking hands. The recording was time-stamped, archived, forgotten for a few days, then discovered by accident by one of the younger priests performing inventory. He watched it 3 times before saying anything, and above the hidden chamber, life at the convent went on. Prayers were said, meals were shared, chores were done. But beneath all of it, something stirred in the stone. Something that had waited for years. Something that now had a new voice. In the days following the initial discovery, the atmosphere inside the convent shifted subtly, but unmistakably. The chapel remained quiet and bright as always, the routines outwardly unchanged, the prayers recited with steady rhythm, and the younger sisters moved through the halls with a respectful hush. But underneath this polished surface, There pulsed a growing current of suspicion, unease, and suppressed fear. Whispers that once died behind closed doors now clung to the corners of corridors, caught between flickering candles and the echo of worn shoes on stone floors. At the heart of it all was the locked door of the monastery library, a door that had long remained unopened, a door that seemed to hum with the tension of something waiting. It was Sister Marianne, curious and deeply troubled, who began to notice the subtle inconsistencies in the Mother Superior's behavior. Each night, the head nun vanished shortly after final prayers, slipping away with a soft click of her heels, echoing down the west hall. At first it seemed routine, perhaps a moment of solitude or devotion, but Marianne's growing suspicion pushed her to act. She waited one night, hidden behind the heavy velvet curtains near the altar, watching as the elder woman entered the old library with an ornate iron key that no other nun possessed. The door opened with a creak too heavy for the hour, then shut again with a finality that made Marianne's skin prickle. The next morning, long before the others awoke, Marianne slipped into the sacristy and searched through the drawers until she found the duplicate keyring left behind decades ago by a former caretaker. One key, older and rusted, bore the same faded marking she had seen on the library door. Her hands trembled slightly as she tucked it into her habit, unsure whether it was fear or anticipation gripping her so tightly. That night, under the cover of sleep and silence, she approached the door. It took her 2 tries to steady the key in the lock and a third to turn it fully. The door groaned open into darkness. The musty air inside the library was different from the rest of the convent, heavier, laced with age, dust, and something less familiar. She stepped inside, her candle's flame flickering wildly as if resisting the intrusion. The library was filled with books the sisters never read, tomes in Latin, Greek, and older dialects, many of them without spines, their pages bound in rough leather or wrapped in twine. The shelves towered high, stretching into a vaulted ceiling barely visible in the dim light. It was a forgotten place, preserved like an ancient crypt. As Marianne moved deeper, she saw a central reading table covered with cloth. Atop it lay one book unlike the others, thicker with a blackened cover cracked by time. There were wax stains around it and what looked like dried herbs, scattered purposefully, not carelessly. She recognized it not as a prayer book, but as something else entirely. Its title was etched faintly in gold, now nearly illegible, but what caught her attention more was the symbol burned into the front, an inverted chalice wrapped in serpents. Carefully she opened it. The pages were brittle, but the ink remained dark and legible. The first few pages described ancient liturgies, but not of Christ. The language was foreign yet eerily rhythmic, suggesting chants or recitations meant not for prayer, but invocation. As she turned further, she found detailed instructions for nocturnal rituals, sequences involving incense, arrangement of candles, specific offerings, and a recurring emphasis on secrecy. The markings in the margins were recent. Someone had written notes, corrections, refinements, even updates. The handwriting was delicate, deliberate, and unmistakably that of the Mother Superior. Then she found the diagram. Drawn with ink and faded watercolor, it mapped the convent itself. Beneath the chapel, behind the altar, there was a small stairwell leading down to what was labeled the Vesper Vault. It was not on any official layout. Marianne traced the lines with her fingers, suddenly remembering the soft, hollow sound. The floor made near the altar's back wall when walked upon, a spot no one ever stepped on during service. Realizing the full implication, she closed the book and reached for a nearby cloth to wrap it. But before she could move, her candle flickered violently. A breeze, impossibly cold for the sealed room, brushed past her cheek. She turned. Nothing. Just rows of books and shadows. But the door she had left slightly ajar now stood wide open. Her breath caught in her throat. She backed away, clutching the book tightly against her chest. The next morning, Sister Marianne said nothing. She acted as she always had, attending prayers, joining the others in tending the garden, and reciting psalms with a calm face, but inside everything had changed. She now knew there was something beneath their sacred ground, something accessed through ritual, something protected for centuries and now revived. She no longer saw the Mother Superior as merely stern and enigmatic. She saw her as a woman who held power not through divine grace but through ancient knowledge passed down in whispers. That night, Marianne returned the key. She said nothing to the others, not yet. She wasn't ready. The book now lay hidden beneath the loose boards of her cell. She didn't sleep, not really. Her thoughts circled around the symbol on the cover, the notes in the margins, the hidden vault. The rituals were written in such detail, so exact, that it became clear. These were not relics of a forgotten age. They were instructions still, in use. And someone in the convent was following them, every midnight. Under the low-hung ceiling of the Abbey security office, the hum of the servers was the only sound that broke the stillness. The night was deep and quiet, with the air holding that specific kind of silence that suggested the world was unaware of something about to go terribly wrong. Brother Luis, one of the monastery's outside technical volunteers, had arrived earlier that week to help resolve what had been reported as a minor glitch in the internal camera storage system. The system had been updated to an automatic cloud-based backup process, a precaution advised by the Archdiocese for all religious institutions, meant to ensure transparency and security. But that night the system didn't work as expected. It worked better, too well. At precisely 2:12 a.m., while the convent lay still and every room was dark, save for the soft flicker of candles in the chapel, the footage from the hidden camera, installed behind the altar, began uploading not just to the secured archive as intended, but to the shared diocesan network drive, a space accessible to regional clergy, administrative staff, and, unbeknownst to anyone in the monastery, a small group of external consultants performing audits. The footage, automatically flagged as unusual activity, had been processed by the software's pattern detection system, which then, following protocol, distributed the alert via internal communication threads. At 7:44 a.m. the next morning, Father Matthias of the St. Joseph Parish office opened his inbox. He hadn't expected to find a system notification titled, "Unusual Movement, Sacred Chapel Zone 3. Curious but not alarmed, he clicked the link. The file loaded slowly, the grainy video buffering, pixelated at first and then coming into disturbing clarity. What he saw in those few minutes unsettled him to the point where his hand hovered over the mouse, unsure whether to pause or keep watching. There was the altar he had visited many times. There was the chapel he remembered as serene, holy. And there was Mother Miriam, alone, at midnight, kneeling at the altar, whispering something with her eyes closed, before opening the panel, beneath the tabernacle and retrieving something that had no place in any church. The object was wrapped in cloth, but its shape was unmistakable, angular, metallic, and far too secular. What she did next wasn't entirely clear. The camera's angle obscured part of her actions, but Father Matthias saw enough to know it was not prayer, not silence, not sacrament. He closed the video, heart thudding in his chest, then reopened it, needing to be sure. It played again. The timestamp matched the alert's title, 12:03 a.m. to 12:16 a.m. The video was real. Elsewhere that morning, in an administrative office tucked behind a parish center across the state, another priest opened the same file, then a lay audit clerk, then a theology professor who had been granted access for a completely unrelated matter. Within hours, the footage had been downloaded 4 times and watched, in fragments, by at least 8 people. Whispers started forming around its contents. No names were used, just coded references to Zone 3 and the Mother at St. Agnes. It didn't take long for someone to mention the phrase ritualistic behavior in an internal thread. Another message followed suggesting that the footage be reported directly to the bishop's office. One archivist, having watched it with growing discomfort, flagged it under ecclesiastical irregularity, a term vague enough to allow plausible deniability but serious enough to trigger a formal inquiry. Back at St. Agnes, Mother Miriam remained unaware. Her days unfolded as they always had, meticulously structured, modestly quiet. Morning prayers, kitchen rotation, silent reading hours. She moved with the grace of someone who carried both discipline and secrets. She believed the camera remained, untouched, unnoticed. She believed her midnights were hers alone. It was Sister Elena who first sensed a change. A missed phone call from the diocesan office, a longer than usual silence from their regional liaison. And then a manila envelope arrived, hand-delivered, not mailed, an irregularity in itself. Sister Elena didn't open it. She brought it straight to Mother Miriam, her expression tightly held. When the envelope was unsealed, it contained nothing more than a printed screenshot. The timestamp was clear, the grain of the image undeniable. It showed the altar, the open tabernacle, and Mother Miriam, frozen mid-motion, back arched, hands clasping something unidentifiable, but alarming. The implications hit like ice water. Someone outside had seen. And they hadn't just seen. They had made copies, sent alerts, spread the recording through the quiet digital corridors of the church's own infrastructure. What was meant to remain cloaked in silence had slipped, without warning, into the public machinery of ecclesiastical accountability. By evening, the air in the abbey had shifted. Sister Julianne whispered too cautiously. The groundskeeper avoided eye contact. A call came in from an unfamiliar number and rang 3 times before being disconnected. When Mother Miriam walked through the corridor, the hush was different, not reverent but expectant. Someone had spoken, or was about to. The camera's eye had captured more than movement. It had documented something that could not be easily explained away. She sat in her office long after the others had gone to rest. The printout lay on her desk. The still image stared back at her. She had underestimated the system's reach, or overestimated her own control. Whatever she had done, whatever she had retrieved, spoken, touched, it no longer existed only in the shadowed chapel of midnight. It was out there now, being watched, dissected, judged. And the church, once her shield, might now be her witness. Or her executioner. Under a cold gray sky, the monastery walls stood as silent as ever. From the outside, nothing had changed. The gardens remained neatly trimmed, the chapel bell still rang precisely on the hour, and the nuns moved through the corridors with the same rehearsed grace. But inside, within the hearts of those who had lived through the ordeal, everything was different now. A silence had settled over the place, not the sacred kind associated with prayer and reverence, but the heavy, suffocating stillness of unspoken truths. Sister Agnes stood by the window of the upper hall, looking out over the cloister. Her hands were clasped together, not in prayer, but in tension. Since the events of the previous week, the atmosphere inside the monastery had grown stranger. The other nuns barely spoke above whispers. Eye contact was avoided. Mealtimes had become rituals of silence and glances exchanged across long tables. The head nun was no longer present. She had vanished without ceremony, without explanation. Only a few knew the real reason, and even fewer dared to speak it aloud. The hidden camera footage had been reviewed in private by a diocesan investigator, someone sent discreetly by the church, far from media attention. The images were grainy but undeniable. Every midnight for nearly a month, the Mother Superior had entered the altar space alone, locking the chapel doors behind her. What followed was bizarre and unsettling. Rituals not in line with any known doctrine, whispered incantations, and strange, rhythmic gestures before the crucifix. Some believed it was a mental breakdown. Others murmured darker things. But when the church arrived to confront her, she was gone. Her room left untouched, clothes still hanging neatly in her wardrobe. Her rosary looped over the headboard as if she'd planned to return. But she hadn't. No one had seen her leave. No vehicle had come. The gates remained locked, the surrounding woods too dense and wild for easy passage. It was as though she had simply dissolved into the shadows. What made it worse was that the church had decided not to make the findings public. The footage was classified as internal matter. The investigation concluded with a vague statement. Mother Beatrice is no longer with the order. The monastery shall continue under interim leadership. Nothing more. No questions answered. The system had gone quiet. Officially, nothing had happened, yet something had happened. The younger nuns still had trouble sleeping. They reported waking in the middle of the night, cold sweat clinging to their backs, the vague sensation of being watched. Some claimed to hear the faint creak of floorboards near the altar long past midnight, though no one dared to go check. Others stopped entering the chapel at night altogether, leaving candles unlit and prayers unsaid. Sister Helena, who had been the first to question the strange noises weeks ago, was now different. She moved through her days with robotic precision, her eyes dimmed, like someone carrying a weight too large to name. She never mentioned the hidden camera she had installed. That had been her doing, a silent decision made one night when she couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. She never expected what she would see. The altar, once a place of peace, now felt tainted. It still gleamed under the morning sun, still smelled of wax and wood polish, but it no longer felt sacred. Helena, Agnes, and a few others tried to continue the routines, tried to act as if things were normal, but it was only theater. They had seen something they couldn't unsee, and though the church refused to acknowledge the depth of it, the truth had rooted itself deep in the stone.